So as Hanita mentioned, I work at the Center for Court Innovation. Just for those who aren't familiar with the center, we're a nonprofit based in New York City, as Hanita mentioned, although we work nationally and internationally, doing justice system reform work in a variety of ways. So there's really three main buckets, so to speak, of our work, and I'll be kind of representing two of them today. So we have a very robust research department that evaluates everything that we do, as well as conducts other justice system related research. We have training and technical assistance as a big part of our work. So I am representing two of those training and technical assistance teams that work nationally with justice system practitioners. So one is the Gender and Family Justice team, which addresses gender-based violence and child victimization, child welfare, family court, trauma-informed practices, gender-responsive practices in the justice system, providing training and essentially consulting nationally with different jurisdictions. And I'm also a part of the center's Tribal Justice Exchange. I saw a couple folks in the chat, I think, work in Indian country, so I'm really excited to see you here. Especially with an Oklahoma-based audience. So our tribal team also provides training and technical assistance or consulting with tribal nations throughout the US related to their justice systems. And in addition to research and technical assistance, the center also operates dozens of operating programs throughout the New York City area, in Newark, New Jersey, and in upstate New York, where we design and implement and evaluate innovative justice system practices to address some of the chronic issues and concerns in the justice system. And so I actually worked at one of those programs for 9 years. It's called the Bronx Child Trauma Support Program, which is located at the Bronx District Attorney's Office. So it's in a prosecutor's office, and works with children ages 3 to 15 who've experienced violence and victimization. Most of them are witnesses on criminal cases. So in addition to providing crisis support and trauma-focused psychotherapy, we also explained how the criminal legal system works to these children and to their caregivers, and helps them kind of navigate and interact with the system, including preparing and supporting them as they testified and went to court. So you'll hear me bring up a bunch of different case examples for kids and teens that I've worked with throughout the time I was practicing in the Bronx, and you'll also see as well some artwork that they created about their feelings and thoughts about going to court. So just to give a little overview of what we'll be discussing today, as Hanita mentioned, we have an hour together. And what I'm hoping to cover is a very brief overview profile of children's exposure to violence and experiences of victimization in the United States, all of which can really lead to their interaction with the criminal legal system as the victim or witness on a criminal case. Then we'll talk about how children experience the criminal legal system. What are some of the thoughts and feelings that they have? What are the ways in which their experience of the system is unique based on their developmental stages? We'll talk about the goals of kind of providing kid-friendly education and support to children as they navigate the criminal legal system, as well as some specific strategies for how to do that. And then the last thing I'll talk about is what we call our Child Witness Materials Project, which is actually wrapping up. It's funded by the Office for Victims of Crime, which is part of the US Department of Justice. But through that project, we've been able to kind of utilize all of our practice knowledge, as well as a lot of research that we've conducted, needs assessment, et cetera, to create a package of interactive, developmentally appropriate, trauma-informed written materials to be used with children and adolescents as they navigate the criminal legal and or the child welfare system. So I'll be talking about those materials, showing you some examples, and discussing kind of best practices in utilizing them, as well as how you can access those materials. And if we have time, which hopefully we will, I would love to chat with you all briefly about kind of implementation, essentially, how you can utilize the information and the strategies that we've discussed in your community and in your work. So children's exposure to violence in the US, I'm sure many of these statistics are very familiar to you. So I'll just, again, go through it quickly, but unfortunately, many children, both boys and girls, experience sexual abuse or sexual assault, about 1 in 9 girls and about 1 in 53 boys, although of course it's very difficult for most of these statistics to really get accurate numbers because so much violence and victimization is never disclosed to any kind of legal system or other helping system. We estimate about 1 in 15 children are exposed to intimate partner violence by the time they reach the age of 18. And in 2019, 656,000, which is a pretty astounding number, of children were identified as victims of abuse and or neglect by the child welfare system, meaning they had an indicated or founded case involving their families. In research with adolescents, the numbers are also pretty astounding. So this was a big national study, found that 60% of teens had been exposed to at least some form of violence in the previous year. It could be peer violence, it could be family violence, community violence. And one study with urban adolescents, specifically 22% of them had witnessed a shooting. So a potentially very traumatic experience, certainly. And polyvictimization is very common, and you may have seen this in your work as well. So often a child will come to our attention because of one particular type of violence or victimization that we know the child has experienced, but often that child, that family have experienced many types of chronic violence and victimization over time. So it's really important that we kind of be assessing for the totality of those experiences. And in most cases, as I'm sure you're aware, the perpetrator is known to the child, and often it's someone that they have a very close relationship, which can get very difficult emotionally when it comes to that person potentially being prosecuted in a criminal case. So all of these types of exposure to violence and victimization, as I mentioned, can lead to the child having to interact with these legal systems, either the criminal legal system and or the child welfare system. And these are systems that are really generally adult oriented. They're designed for adults, but even adults who don't work in these systems often don't understand how the systems work and feel very overwhelmed and confused and distressed upon having to interact with these systems. So you can imagine how difficult it would be for a child or a teen to navigate that. And in addition, some of the other effects of exposure to violence, as you're probably aware, are traumatization, including the development of post-traumatic stress disorder, which I'll talk about more in a moment, depression, suicidality, self-harm, anxiety, difficulties with family and peer relationships, especially if the violence or abuse has taken place within the family system. There can be aggression and risk-taking. There can be cognitive, developmental, and academic difficulties because of the chronic toxic stress on the child that affects their well-being and their ability to pay attention and focus at school and even to think clearly. There's a possibility for re-victimization as an adolescent or as an adult, unfortunately. And as I've mentioned, kind of the interaction with these adult-oriented systems, which can compound the stress and the traumatization that the children experience. So just a note on PTSD in children, it's a similar presentation as in adults. Although there are some developmentally specific differences, and I'll be talking about kind of how this can influence how the child interacts with the criminal legal system and how it interacts with us as providers, especially those of us working within the justice system. But there are 4 clusters of symptoms for post-traumatic stress disorder. Again, same in children as adults. So the first cluster of symptoms is re-experiencing. Those are the ways in which the memory of the traumatic experience continues to overwhelm and to cause emotional and physiological distress for the child. So these are things like flashbacks, intrusive thoughts and memories, like you can't get it out of your head, nightmares, becoming very emotionally distressed or physiologically distressed when reminded of the experience. And then the counterpoint to that is the avoidance symptoms. So because the memories are so distressing and overwhelming and dysregulating, folks develop all sorts of avoidance strategies to kind of mitigate their distress. So they do a lot of jump through psychological hoops to avoid thinking about it, to avoid being reminded of it. They may not want to talk about it. They may numb themselves emotionally. They may even dissociate. So lots of different ways that folks avoid the memories because they are so distressing and overwhelming. Then we also see sometimes negative alterations on cognitions and mood, meaning just how the child or the adult kind of thinks about themselves, how they think about the world, about other people, obviously depressed mood, irritability as well. But an example of a cognition would be the world is a scary and dangerous place. Something terrible could happen at any moment. I can't trust anyone ever again. I'm to blame for what happened. I'm permanently damaged because of it, things like that. And then we also see alterations in arousal and reactivity. So these are kids that are very jumpy, that have an exaggerated startle response when there's a trauma trigger. So they're jumping, they have trouble sleeping, concentrating, that kind of thing. And what might this look like if you're interacting with a child? Again, it's very individual to the child in terms of how the potentially traumatic experience affects them and the degree of trauma symptoms that they may have. But as I mentioned, trauma really influences very strongly how children respond to the criminal legal system and how they respond to us. So we'll see that, you'll see that in interactions and in the relationship with the child as it develops. But some children, again, because of the avoidance symptoms, may have flat emotions. Their emotions may be volatile, all over the place, or inappropriate, meaning they're laughing at a kind of unusual time, or then they become very angry, or they become really flooded emotionally, especially when they're recalling kind of the details of what happened or having a flashback. And sometimes folks who haven't worked with kids who've experienced trauma may question the child's kind of accounting of what happened. Like, if, you know, these terrible things really happen, like, how come you're not showing any feeling, you know, when you describe those events? And that can be because of the child's traumatization. Children as well can be very guarded and suspicious and mistrustful, again, for very good reason when we think about what they may have been through, especially if they've been harmed or seen other people that they love harmed by, you know, someone that they trust. They really have a lot of reason not to trust us, especially when we're strangers and we're adults and we're working within this very foreign and intimidating system. So really kind of keeping that in mind, that children may have a wall up, and that's just something that we need to kind of validate and be patient around. Their disclosures may be delayed. There are many reasons why children delay telling someone about what's happened or have trouble talking about it. They may disclose things in a fragmented way, meaning in bits and pieces, or in a way that's non-chronological. So they're not able to tell you about A and then B and then C and then D and then E, but they tell you about A and then D and then B and then E and then C and a little bit of F. So the disclosures may not come in the way that we necessarily expect, and that can be because of their traumatization as well. And folks who are traumatized, children and adults alike, can be triggered by trauma reminders and by a sense of loss of control. So, which also reminds them of the traumatic experience. So even if it's like being kind of directed what to do or having to follow a lot of rules, things that may seem innocuous to someone who's traumatized can be triggering and scary for them. And there may also be refusal to discuss certain topics and self-censoring. So there's kind of a complicated analysis that folks go through in terms of what do I share with whom, how will the information be used, what will the consequences be for me and my family if I share certain pieces of information. So thinking in more detail about how children experience the criminal legal system, it's very much influenced by adults' response. As you all know, children, especially younger children, but even teenagers, are really dependent on their adult caregivers for their well-being and for their safety. And they're highly attuned to adults' feelings, right, and thoughts about situations. And they look to adults to kind of get their cues for how they should feel and think about a situation and what they should do. So if a child's caregiver or parent is traumatized themselves, if they're very angry, if they're very distressed, or being triggered by what's happening, that will very much increase the child's distress as well. Whereas if the adult's own trauma and grief is addressed, if they have access to the healing supports they need, as well as the concrete resources that they need, if they feel informed about what's going on, if they know healthy coping skills that they can utilize and do with their child, et cetera, then the child is going to be in a much better position in terms of their well-being. So I'll talk more about this in a moment, but it just speaks to the really critical importance of not working with children in isolation, which we never want to do, but especially in this circumstance, because the parent, the caregiver, is always going to be the child's most important source of ongoing support. And their kind of close bond and secure attachment with that person, with a safe, consistent caregiver, is the most important protective factor for children. So the more that we can do to support that parent and to support healing in that relationship and strengthening that relationship, that will benefit children tremendously. As well, children often feel and experience that they have to repeatedly tell adult strangers about really the most painful, traumatic, difficult, upsetting, disgusting even experiences that they've ever had. In some circumstances, especially sexual abuse, these may be things that the child has been keeping secret for years. And so now to finally have disclosed, they may it just may be incredibly difficult to talk about what's happened, especially when they are asked over and over again the same questions by different adults in different settings. It's difficult to talk about it even one time, but to be asked to talk about it over and over again is incredibly difficult. And just so you all know, even with models such as child advocacy centers that try to minimize the number of interviews, children still do have to talk about it repeatedly. As I alluded to before, there's also tremendous confusion and misinformation about how the system works on the part of children and adults, right? There are things that folks see on the news, that folks see on TV and in movies that are very dissimilar to how that system actually functions in real life, for better or for worse. And so their expectations may not align with the realities of how the system works. And so that, of course, increases their distress when they don't know what to expect, when they don't understand what's happening, or even the language that's being used to explain things to them. And as I alluded to before, there are also often secondary consequences of their disclosure or of the abuse or violence coming to the attention of these quote unquote helping systems, which may not feel like they're actually helping. They may feel to the child, to the family, like they're making the situation worse. Or less safe, depending on what the situation is. But some of these consequences may be the child being removed from a parent or caregiver and being placed with another caregiver, being placed in foster care, the child having to go into a domestic violence shelter, or having to move, having to leave their school, having to leave behind their pets or their belongings from a home, being separated from siblings, right? Just their routines. Their children really thrive and benefit from familiarity and predictability and kind of routines and habits. And this kind of thing can really just upend their entire life, essentially, and just make everything feel disrupted, which can be really, really scary and distressing for kids. Even having to miss school to go to court, having to miss school to go to interviews can be difficult. Being late for school, not being able to see friends that they used to see, or family members who they may now be separated from. There are a lot of kind of cascading effects of the system involvement that sometimes we forget to consider in terms of how the child is perceiving and experiencing. And sometimes what we see when kids don't have adequate support is that kids may recant, meaning they say, oh, that's not actually what happened, because they're feeling at that time, like the negative consequences of their participating in the system of disclosing are outweighing the potential benefits. Children also may feel forced to participate in the criminal legal system as a victim or witness. They may feel like it's yet another thing that's kind of being done to them. It may feel coercive. They may feel like their voice is unheard. And again, that they're kind of being shuffled along and used for this case that maybe they don't want to move forward, or that they have very conflicting feelings about. And the lengthy delays can feel like a lifetime. As I'm sure you're all aware, children, especially young children, have a very different sense of time. If you tell a 5-year-old about something that's going to happen in a week or a month or 6 months, it really doesn't mean much to them, right? They don't understand time in that sense yet. And also thinking about their lifespan, we have a 5-year-old and a case, as criminal legal cases sometimes do, takes 1.5 years or 2 years. That's almost half of that child's entire lifetime. And during that time, there's this tremendous sense of lack of resolution and fear and anxiety. What's going to happen with the case, and therefore what's going to happen to me, what's going to happen to my family, and just not having kind of those answers. It can really feel like a dark cloud hanging over the child's head as things are working themselves out towards some resolution. So those delays can be incredibly stressful for children. I should have mentioned before, but you see an illustration here from our child witness materials. So I've integrated them throughout as well. And this child is, this character's name is Malik, and he's saying there are so many people in my business. So just this feeling that the system is very intrusive, and they kind of lose their sense of privacy and feel like maybe I said something to a friend at school, and now this all these systems responses are happening, and I've totally lost control over what's happening now. And again, it feels like another loss of control. It feels coercive. So thinking about when children interact with the criminal legal system, what are the goals of our work with them around this? And I see kind of 3 interrelated goals. The first is really to reduce children's anxiety, reduce their distress, reduce the potential for re-traumatization that can happen through their interaction with the system. And when we are able to reduce their distress, a secondary goal or benefit is that it can improve the quality of their testimony if they do have to testify, and I'll talk more about that. But in general, we want to think about creating a more positive and empowering experience for children. We don't want to, these are children that have already been through a lot, right? They may have lost a loved one to homicide. They may have experienced sexual abuse. They may have, been exposed to intimate partner violence involving their parents. Like, we don't want to kind of add to their stress and distress. We want to think about how the system can empower and support them. So what are some of the strategies that we can use to support children as they interact with the system? I'm going to talk about each of these in turn in more detail. But I did just want to make an additional note. I may sound like a broken record, but just again, the critical importance of working with parents and caregivers. We are only temporary, right? And even if we're working with a child that's involved with a case as a therapist, and we see them for an hour once a week, maybe over a year, it's still a drop in the bucket in terms of the child's overall life trajectory and even their life right now. 1 hour out of, hundreds of hours they experience each week. So we really need to think about the parents and caregivers and assessing what their needs are as well. They may also be traumatized by the experience. Either if their child was sexually abused, for example, the parent can be traumatized by that. If there was intimate partner violence, the parent may have been directly traumatized. If there's been a homicide, obviously the parent may be traumatized. They may be grieving as well as the child. So really thinking about what are the needs of that parent or caregiver in terms of their mental health and well-being, but also in terms of concrete supports, things that can just reduce their level of stress, ways that they can also be informed and empowered as they interact with the criminal legal system, because they really need the same, often the same types of information and the same supports that the child needs. And when the parents have that, then they can then in turn directly support their children and feel empowered to do that. So as I mentioned, I'd be getting to this topic around children testify, which I know can be really fraught and concerning for folks. I've worked with dozens of children who have testified, and I can say that it really does need to be determined on a case-by-case basis in terms of the child's needs, in terms of their healing process, in terms of their feelings about and relationship to the case and to the defendant, in terms of their ability to access trauma-focused therapy that can help them heal from the traumatic experience or their traumatic grief and help them feel more empowered and be less symptomatic or distressed by having to talk about what happened. So there are situations in which a child has adequate support and does have access to trauma-focused therapy in which testifying can actually be empowering. I've supported children who have actually felt that way, that it was a chance for the child to tell their story publicly, to break the silence, especially if there was silence for a long time of, you don't air the family's dirty laundry, or, you can't tell anyone about what happened to you because then you're going to get in trouble, and all these ways in which perpetrators, offenders, coerce silence out of children and families. So it's really a chance to break that silence, to stand up and say, this is not okay, what you did to me or what you did to my mom, and I'm going to stand up for us. As well, of course, there are many circumstances in which cases simply cannot be prosecuted without the child's testimony as a witness, especially thinking about sexual abuse cases in which there's generally no other witnesses available, but there may be other circumstances in which the child's testimony is really kind of critical to the case being able to move forward. Cons or disadvantages of testifying, again, especially if the child doesn't have the support and information that they need, it can be very distressing, especially because they will have to talk about their experience in a lot of detail if they testify. The repeated delays, as I mentioned, can be very distressing. So you can imagine if a child kind of how much anxiety there can be kind of anticipating having to testify, that the child gets themselves ready emotionally, gets all their supports in place and their coping plan and all those kind of things, only to be told the day before, it's not happening tomorrow. Now you're going to testify in 2 months. And how disappointing and frustrating that can be, but also how difficult emotionally. And then 2 months later, maybe it happens again. The case is adjourned again. So that's very, very difficult for kids. And sometimes kids and families can just be like, forget it. I'm not doing this anymore. I want to just move on. I don't want to deal with this. It's too painful and difficult. I want to just kind of pretend this never happened and move on with my life. It's been years. So that can be really tough. And the relationship with the defendant, as I've kind of been alluding to, it can be extremely difficult. So, and complex and conflicted. So, especially where the perpetrator is someone that was close to the child, a parent, another family member, a coach, that kind of relationship. The child may still love that person very much. They may miss them and feel very sad and be grieving at the loss of that relationship with that person who is very important in their life, while also being very angry with them for what they did, while also be feeling scared of them, while also being relieved that the abuse or violence is no longer happening, while blaming themselves for the abuse or violence or for that person getting in trouble, worrying about what will happen to that person when they're in jail. Is someone going to hurt them? So the feelings can just be incredibly complex and conflicting, and there can be so much ambivalence. As well, children and their parents may have very different feelings about a criminal case. For example, a parent may very much want the defendant to be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law and want that person to be incarcerated for 30 years or longer, while the child may not want them to be prosecuted at all, or vice versa, depending on their relationship with the defendant and their feelings about what happened. So that can be very tricky as well, and speaks to the importance, again, of providing support to the parent or caregiver, including providing them with their own therapist, providing them with their own victim advocate. Even if they weren't the direct victim of the crime, it's still really, really important that they have their own support and their own space to talk through their feelings about the case. So again, so that they can support their child in the ways that they want to. So now I'm going to talk about some of the strategies that I used and that can be really beneficial. So the first one is consultation with the prosecutor. At the program that I worked in, as I mentioned, it was located at the prosecutor's office. So I realized that this may be a difficult strategy for folks to implement that work in a different context, but you might want to think about how you can utilize some of these elements of the strategy. But we did talk with prosecutors about whether a particular child should testify based on kind of their symptom picture, their level of distress, their healing process, their ability to participate in therapy and that kind of thing, and how the testimony, how the case fits into their healing process, and also talking with the prosecutor about the potential need for special accommodations for the child, whether that's the ability to testify via closed circuit television or via video, whether there's a need for a closed courtroom if the child has safety concerns about certain people showing up to court when they testify, whether there's a need for a particular support person, support object, support animal in some jurisdictions is available, whether there's a need for a screen that blocks the child's view of the defendant. So there are different possibilities in different communities. And it's really important to talk with the prosecutor about what's available and what the child could benefit from. And then they would need to make a motion before the court to get approval for that strategy. So all this said, in my practice in the Bronx, unfortunately, I never saw any of these strategies used, but I've heard that in other communities, it's very common. So again, talk with your colleagues about what's possible where you are. Also just consulting with prosecutors about kind of best practices for interviewing with and engaging children, building rapport, how they can kind of prepare a particular child based on their developmental stage and age and the circumstances of the case. And also thinking about crisis support for kids before, during, and after their interviews with prosecutors, which can be as distressing as testifying. Sometimes folks don't think about this, but when kids are often repeatedly interviewed by prosecutors over the course of a case, and again, this could be over years, a period of years, and often in those interviews, they may have to recount repeatedly again, kind of the details of what happened to them, which of course can be very distressing and difficult. And triggering for them as well. That when they meet with a prosecutor, they may hear news about the case. For example, that a case is not going forward, that a prosecution is not going to continue, which could be for a variety of reasons. That can be very distressing for them. Or they may hear about kind of a guilty plea agreement. I had one teen who had been sexually abused. The defendant had taken video of the sexual abuse, and she actually had to look at the video footage and provide dates to the prosecutor in an interview. This was obviously incredibly distressing for her. So we did a lot of preparation before that interview, and I was available to meet with her immediately following. So there's other situations in which a prosecutor and advocate is concerned that a child is suicidal, or the child shuts down or becomes extremely distressed. So it's really important that a therapist be available to provide support immediately in those types of circumstances. And then thinking about kid-friendly education. So really thinking about, I've kind of alluded to the fact that often we, even despite our best intentions, we may explain the system to kids and their caregivers in ways that they really don't understand. I have here jokingly, watch your language, because even words like court or hearing may not be familiar or may be misinterpreted. For a younger child, a court may be a basketball court or a tennis court. A hearing may be what you do with your ears. So if we're using this language, the kid's just going to be increasingly perplexed, right? And not understand what you're talking about. And often children don't feel comfortable saying, I don't understand what you're talking about, right? Especially to an adult, and especially an unfamiliar adult. So the more we're able to provide information about how the system works, what are the next steps, what are the processes, what are the roles of the different people that work in the system, what are your rights, what are the questions that you can ask, the more information we can provide, it really goes a very long way in terms of increasing children's sense of control over the situation and increasing the sense of predictability. We want to really remove as many surprises as possible. We want that predictability, because the traumatic experience itself was characterized by chaos and unpredictability and loss of control. So we want to think about how can we impart, again, a sense of control and predictability for children and for their families, which will go a very long way in terms of decreasing their anxiety and distress. And then, as I mentioned, explaining how the system works, including what is their role as a witness on the case. Children put a tremendous amount of pressure and stress on themselves to essentially carry a case, especially if they're the only witness. It can feel like the entire thing is riding on their shoulders, and that can just be so difficult. So they can feel like, you know, if there's a conviction, it was my fault. If there's an acquittal, then that's also my fault, right? And everybody's kind of looking to me to carry this case. Which is not actually an accurate understanding of the role of a witness. So one of the kind of analogies that I like to use to explain it is that the case is like a puzzle. It's like a very complicated puzzle with a lot of different pieces. And in order for there to be a conviction at trial, the judge or the jury has to see that all pieces of the puzzle fit together perfectly. There aren't any gaps at all between the puzzle pieces. There aren't any missing pieces. There aren't any damaged pieces. If there's any gaps or problems with the puzzle, then they have to say that the person is not guilty, even if they believe you, because they have to believe beyond a reasonable doubt. So this is essentially a way of explaining the beyond a reasonable doubt standard. So kind of analogies or imagery like that can be really helpful in kind of taking some of that pressure off children. And that it's really the prosecutor's job to make all the pieces, you know, be there in the trial and to make them all fit together perfectly. It's not your job. Your job is just to tell about what you know. and to answer questions about that. It is important as well to allow the child to visit the courtroom in advance when it's empty, to meet the judge if possible, to sit in the witness chair in the witness box and look around and see where everyone's going to be sitting and figure out, where do I want to look while I'm testifying? One of the most scary things for kids is seeing the defendant. So where is that person going to be sitting, and where can I direct my gaze, or who can I look at, whether it's a support person, whether I want to look at the jury, when I want to look at the lights, whether I want to look at my lap, just figuring out that kind of thing, trying out the microphone, having a glass of water, bringing your kind of comfort object with you, and just, the more familiar it is, the better, because that will decrease the anxiety. I had a really nice experience very early on in my career where I worked with an 8-year-old girl who had witnessed her mother being raped and physically assaulted by the mom's boyfriend at the time. And my client, the 8-year-old, had to testify about this. So I took her to the courtroom in advance, and she sat in the witness box, and the judge was just so kind. And he was wearing his robe. Some judges will remove their robe as not intimidate. But the judge just turned to her and said, "Hi, what's your name?" And she says, "I'm Erica." And he goes, "Hi, I'm Matt. It's so nice to meet you. Thanks for coming." And it was just really helped her feel better about the experience, and feeling, seeing him as an ally, and he was going to be sitting next to her. You can also do a diagram of your particular courtroom. We have an example in our child witness materials that you can utilize and kind of show where all the different stakeholders or practitioners are sitting, where the child will be sitting, or you can draw your own. But just an important note for those of us who are not prosecutors or attorneys, that when you're preparing a child, you should address kind of their informational needs, their emotional needs, but don't discuss the content of the child's testimony, because that can actually damage kind of their credibility as a witness and the case. So leave that to the prosecutor to discuss those details. So now I have my first kind of artwork. So this was created by a teen boy who'd been sexually abused by his mom's boyfriend, who was actually a police officer. And he had to testify at trial, and he drew this picture of what he imagined court was going to be like. And this figure on the right, who's kind of a monster, is the defendant. He kind of perceived him as a monster, and he had this fantasy really of the court officer slapping the defendant in the face, and he says, "Oh shit, ha ha ha," pardon my language. But that was kind of actually helped him feel a little better, kind of imagining this, that was how it would go. But we also used, as you can see here, kind of to diagram where everyone would be sitting in the courtroom. So in terms of the emotional concerns, though, they're extremely case specific. So really thinking through with the child through, as they're having to answer questions about what happened, what will be most distressing or triggering for them, having to describe, are there particular details that are most difficult for them to verbalize, for them to say out loud, that they feel most disgusted about, or that they worry about people in the audience or in the jury hearing them describe. And again, it's going to be very specific to that child. And then really allowing for them to express strong emotions about the case, about testifying, about the defendant before they go to court. So for example, I worked with a child, he was 12, but developmentally, he was probably about 7 or 8. And his mother had been murdered, and he had to testify. And the idea of seeing the defendant he just was filled with rage, and he hadn't actually seen this man in over 2 years. So the idea of walking into the courtroom and being in his presence was very, very distressing, understandably. So we really had to provide the opportunity in therapy for him to really get those feelings out and figure out how to kind of cope with them in the moment when he went to testify. And that relates to processing the relationship with and the feelings toward the defendant or the respondent and about the case, as I've been talking about, and allowing for that ambivalence and the conflicting feelings. And one tool that you can use for this is called the Court Fears and Worries Questionnaire. I adapted it from a questionnaire created by an agency in Canada called the London Family Court Clinic. And I'll provide I'll show you some of the items on the next slide, but it's really helpful because it has just like maybe 30 questions, and they're just for each one. The child thinks about, am I worried about such and such? And checks off if they're worried about it, not at all, a little bit, or a lot. And it really helps you tailor your support strategies to that child's particular fears and worries and concerns, because some kids will have things that they're not worried about at all and other things that they're very, very worried about. And some things you can easily address just with some information. So if the child is worried about the defendant like hurting them in the courtroom, for example, you can talk about all the protections that are in place to make sure that they're not able to hurt them in the courtroom. And again,
you have serve you about 5 more minutes.
Great, thank you, Anita. And then again, thinking about the role and the timing of trauma therapy in this process. So these are just some of the examples from that questionnaire. So the biggest fear for kids is seeing the defendant in the courtroom. So doing planning around that, but also crying or being upset, being hurt by the defendant, having to describe what happened, not understanding what they're supposed to do, or the defendant lying in court and being believed, meaning there's an acquittal. So I'm going to go a little more quickly. Some of this we've already covered, but also helping the child plan around relaxation and coping skills, building on their strengths, what they already do to cope, and thinking about how you can adapt those coping skills to the courtroom, visualizing a positive, empowering experience. What are objects that the child can bring with them, hold in their hand, in their pocket, whether it's a smooth stone, a feather, a locket that reminds them of someone that they love, anything like that. People who they want to be there to support them, and who are maybe people that they don't want to be there, and helping them have those conversations. Thinking about their self-talk around going to court or participating in an interview. Is their thought accurate and helpful? And if not, creating a replacement thought. So if the thought is, there's no way I can get through this, I'm gonna fall apart, I can't handle it, then that's not accurate, because we can't tell the future, but it's also not helpful to the child's well-being. So a replacement thought could be something around, this is going to be really hard for me, but I have a lot of support and I'm strong and I know I can get through this. And you can actually have the child write those thoughts as well as their coping skills on like an index card that they can bring with them. Thinking about breathing exercises, grounding activities that can actually be done while the child is testifying or in an interview to kind of bring them back to the present if they have a flashback or feel overwhelmed, and also cultural and spiritual practices that they can use. This is another artwork by a child. This was her fear that she would testify and there would be an acquittal, and that this is the defendant on the left depicted as a devil drinking a beer and celebrating. And she says, why, oh, why, what a waste of time, and is crying a puddle of tears. So that was her fear. And then she was also afraid of him shooting her, even though she knew, she was 13, that he couldn't do that, but that was kind of a fear that she had. So then I had her create an image of a more positive experience. So she has the court officer protecting her, and she has a guilty verdict, and she actually depicted as well her support people, which included her mother and myself. And then court accompaniment. So children can benefit from accompaniment to testify in the grand jury for felony cases, to hearings, to trial, to family court. Providing distracting activities for their wait. Sometimes they may have to wait for a very long time in court to testify, reinforcing their coping skills, just being a friendly face in the courtroom. There may be people in the courtroom, family members, friends they haven't seen in a long time that they may also be very distressed or eager to see, but they may feel upset if those people are kind of on the defendant's side, for example. So that can be difficult, and relates to assisting with managing unwanted contact. So planning ahead, what if the defendant's family members or friends approach you and want to talk to you? What if the media approaches you? How do you want to handle that? And then providing emotional support during breaks in their testimony and if they become distressed. And this is a really nice quote that really speaks to the power of that court accompaniment piece, and the child just having the friendly face while they're testifying. And after the trial, so thinking about what does the case mean for the child's healing process, processing the court experience, what was positive or empowering, what was most difficult or challenging, what was surprising, how did the child feel during the testimony, how do they feel now, that kind of thing. And explaining outcomes, which again, children may not understand: acquittal, conviction, probation, parole, sentencing, all these kind of terms that are used, plea agreement, explaining plea agreements, explaining verdicts, supporting children in creating a victim impact statement. If they're able to do that, and accompanying them to sentencing hearings can be very important as well. And this is another child's drawing from a younger child who actually felt relieved by the sentence, which was 10 years incarceration. So now I'm just going to talk with you very quickly about the materials that we created and how to access them in your practice. So we created a stakeholders group, which was comprised really of national and local experts on working with child victims and witnesses. We conducted a very extensive needs assessment that included practitioner interviews and focus groups and a survey with over 700 respondents, literature review, reviewing existing materials. We pilot tested the materials with children and caregivers and practitioners and had an expert peer review process. And now we're in the stage of disseminating them, which I'll talk more about. So we have materials for 3 different age groups, which are 2 to 6, 7 to 12, and 13 to 18, although you can use whatever materials are appropriate to the child's developmental stage. And there are separate materials for each age group about the criminal legal system and the child welfare system. And they're really narrative in style and use kind of the stories of characters to explain how the systems work, what are the potential outcomes, and also to validate children's emotional experiences of the system. And they're also trauma informed, and they cover the roles of practitioners a child may meet, the rights of child victims and witnesses, the system's responses and processes, and healthy coping. So just going to scroll through quickly some examples. The part on the left is from the story Brave Maya, which is for younger children who are involved with the child welfare system. And on the right, you'll see an explanation of a practitioner role, which is very important because often kids are just like, who are all these grownups, right? Why are they all asking me questions? This is from the ages 7 to 12, so you'll see there's more detail. This is really comic book style for that middle age, and you'll see as well on the right a coping strategy. And for teenagers, it's graphic novel style. Again, more detail and multiple character stories to represent different types of experiences. And so how to use the materials, it's really important to provide them to both the child and caregiver as early as possible in the justice system process, and regardless of the projected case outcome. So whether or not the child may testify, still give them the materials so they can understand what's going on right now. It's just really, really important. And ensuring that appropriate adult support is available. The materials are not intended to be handed to children for them to work through on their own, but to be worked through side by side with a supportive adult, whether it's a caregiver or a practitioner. And you can read through them in one setting or at different times. You can break it up. You can use the coping skills to kind of take a break. And it's important that you as well do the coping skills as well as helping the children learn them and practicing them. Of course, being mindful that some of the content may be distressing for children and asking questions to kind of keep the child engaged, and you can even tailor the materials for your context. Just some more examples. This is from Brave Oscar for little kids, where he's talking with his therapist about kind of what's happening. Is daddy coming home? How it's affecting him, having tummy aches and that kind of thing. And again, doing a coping skill. More from the middle age 7 to 12. I don't want to go to court. What will they ask me? What if I don't know the answers? And she's talking about her mom and learning another coping skill. And this is from the teenagers again. She's getting support and talking with her about her feelings with her grandmother. And for the teenagers, there's these pages, What's Going On, that explains again and provides more detail about how the system works and what's happening in the story, and also provides some questions that you can utilize to talk with the child about what's happening in the story and how it relates to their case and their experience. So just next steps, these materials have now been published in June. They're available for free online through the Office for Victims of Crime website. I'll provide the link at the end. And you can download them to view on a screen. You can also download them to print on your office computer or for professional printing at Staples or another provider. And there are also brief guides for practitioners for how to use the materials and how to support child victims and witnesses. And there's a corresponding guide for parents and caregivers for how to support their child. And the materials are being translated into 5 additional languages, which you can see here. And those translated versions will be available actually very soon on the website. We're also in the final stages of developing specialized materials for children who have experienced trafficking, labor and/or sex trafficking, for American Indian, Alaska Native children and families, and a suite of materials for the practitioners themselves to strengthen their practice with child victims and witnesses, which are really kind of tools and resources for them to use in their work. For example, a tip sheet or a checklist for how to prepare children to testify, tip sheet on children in trauma, that kind of thing. And these are going to be published in the spring.
Kathryn, we just, great. Just want to leave 5
minutes. That's it. So as I mentioned, here's the link. I can put it in the chat as well, but this is a link where you can access everything. But I also want to encourage everyone as well to please utilize me as a witness, not as a witness, as a support or a resource at any time. Here's my email. I'd be happy to hear from you anytime. So if you need help accessing resources, or if you want a training for your colleagues or anything like that, I'd be happy to hear from you.
Kathryn, thank you so much for this wonderful and inspiring lecture. I think that you really so much knowledge, and you really help us understand the perspective of the children in that area. So thank you very much. I have a question in the chat that I will read. It's only in my chat. And then if other person, I think that maybe we'll have time for 2 more questions. Is the court fears and worries questionnaire is something that can be used by child welfare staff who are not clinicians?
Oh, that's a great question. So it was designed to, you'll see the language is kind of specific to the criminal legal system, but it could definitely be adapted pretty easily for a child who has to testify in the family court on a child welfare matter. You would just have to tweak some of the language for sure. And yeah, it can be used by non-clinicians. So like victim advocates would be, or, you know, child protective services workers could definitely use something like that. Yep. And I'm happy to, maybe in a follow-up email, Hanita, we can send out the slides. And also I'm happy to send that up.